Hello, I'm ACastro. This is my presentation on the Silk Road's brief history for History 498. My overview, what I'm going to talk about in this presentation is what were the Silk Roads and their purpose, how the Silk Roads grew and developed across Asia and the Mediterranean, and how they expanded in the movement of goods around these areas. Benchmarks through the development of the Silk Roads included their beginnings, their influence on the religion, transition, and how they transitioned into water routes from land routes, and then the end of the Silk Roads. And then I'll just wrap up with the conclusion of the presentation. So early origins of the Silk Roads. The purpose of the Silk Roads was to create a network of trade routes which linked people from China to the Mediterranean to facilitate the exchange of goods. This facilitated exchange of goods such as animals, spices, silk. Around 10,000 years ago, earliest forms of trade and exchange were seen in China when goods kicked off a revolution which spurred the creation of Silk Road's trade network. One of the earliest effects of trade in this area was agricultural revolution, where people transitioned from all being primarily hunters and gatherers to growing their own food, or they would take wild animals and domesticate them and use them for farm work or for food. An example of two ecological zones would be the steppe and the zone, where people from the steppe, who are primarily hunters and gatherers, would train and domesticate animals. During the agricultural revolution, the people of the steppe would trade their animals with the people from the zone, which is another ecological zone. People from the zone were primarily into agriculture and farming and didn't move around a lot. And so these two groups would trade animals domesticated in the steppe for wheat grown in the zone, just as an example. Another effect of the development of the Silk Roads and the revolution was the secondary products revolution, which was started around 8,000 to 700,000 years ago, and really kicked off people starting to use animals for products besides their meat, such as milk from cows or horses for riding. As Chinese dynasties looked into expanding their power into the West, the production of silk was expanded as Chinese culture was brought into the Silk Road. Horses became a commodity sought out by the Chinese in efforts to expand their dynasty. Horses facilitated travel and gave them the upper hand in military efforts and were a symbol of imperial power and royalty. Similarly, as Rome moved to expand their empire east, which impacted trade within areas impacted by this, by their military efforts in war and expanding their empire. This is also what helped create the spice route, as it was difficult to trade within these impacted zones. Two main spices which came out of zones impacted by militarization were frankincense and myrrh. So this just shows the expansion of waterways in the Silk Road. So all of this is a really basic map, but all of the red lines are really the land routes, but the lines marked in blue really shows the waterways for the Silk Roads. Trade expanded through the Indian Ocean with waterways, and the waterways they utilized the monsoon winds. The monsoon winds were really predictable and reliable, and transporting items via waterways was smoother and it was more economical. They were able to transport larger quantities. They were able to transport more people. It facilitated different items, like larger quantities of spices, items which were maybe more fragile, could be transported over water because it was smoother. So it really did change the way that trade and transport worked. So the items could be transported via waterways. So they actually also were able to reach Europe at this point. So the Silk Roads had a further reach with the utilization of the water routes. So the historical end of the Silk Roads occurred between the 13th and 15th century and was associated with the Mongols. The Mongol capital was Karakoram, and as the city was not on the Silk Road route, it was really north and kind of off of the Silk Road path. Trade route traffic was diverted into the city once it was really built up to be a rival capital city by the Mongols. The cost to divert trade route traffic was great, and so this meant that the cost of goods went up. It was more expensive to bring merchants there, to bring goods up there, so the Mongols tended to pay double to the merchants, and the cost of goods went up. But this really was a testament and showed the wealth that the Mongols had, and it did also use up a lot of the wealth that the Mongols had. Towards the end of the 14th century, the Mongol Empire began to collapse, and the Europeans began to dominate trade, and trade began to move towards the coastal regions. And trade ended up happening more in the ocean, so Pacific and Atlantic Ocean. This increased the trade of bulk goods, and also it was more cost effective to trade via ocean travel, and they could also increase trade of large amount and fragile items such as Chinese porcelain and things like that, because it was these are items that going across like land routes would break, but going across sea routes they were able to easily transport. So bulk goods increased as trade was more cost effective to transport large amount of items. The Black Plague was also a big reason why the Silk Road really had a historical end at this point. The cities kind of walled themselves off and didn't welcome traders or merchants into their town because that's the Black Plague was spreading, and nobody really knew how or what to do with that. So cities weren't welcoming travelers in, and it really had an impact on land travel. So trade really moved to the coastal areas and into the sea. So in conclusion, the Silk Roads were created out of necessity, and as there were distinct ecological zones doing their own thing, but once they discovered different ways to use the resources they both had, such as domesticating their animals or their food, it was in everyone's best interest to continue trading. This practice spread quickly and facilitated military dominance for centuries. The Silk Roads were used to spread culture, religion, ideas, and of course goods throughout the world during this time. Once it was no longer efficient, it didn't really make sense anymore. The Silk Roads burned out. The fall of the Mongol Empire and the Black Death in combination with new sea trade routes made the Silk Roads irrelevant and no longer needed, so their historical relevance stopped at that point. So that's all I have for you. Thank you for listening to my presentation. Have a great weekend.